Hi, I'm Pat Ehlers from the Fly Fishers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm going to show you one of my favorite crayfish imitations, the Crazi Craw. It's a fly my buddy Matt Banish and I worked on. So come on along and let's get this thing tied up. So here's the materials I used to tie the Crazi Craw. I'm using a Gamakatsu B10S size 4 hook. You could use a 2 as well if you wanted to go a little bit bigger. I'm using the 4. I'm using a 6/0 unithread. Color red, you could use black red, that's not a big deal. For this I use the pseudo eyes in the nickel with the red eyes. I always like using red eyes, especially when I'm fishing smallmouth. And it's the medium sized pseudo eyes. Crinkle mirror flash, this one is in root beer color, comes in a variety of colors, but I'm using the root beer on this one. For the tail I'm using micro pine squirrel zonkers and the crawdad orange. And the body is the ultraviolet polar chenille from Hairline Dubbin. It's one of my favorite fly tying materials. And then we're also using the barred round rubber medium sized legs for our rubber legs on there. All right, let's get started tying the Crazi Craw. I'm going to take some 6/0 thread, get it on the hook here. And the first thing I'm going to do is attach some Dumbbell Eyes. I'm going to use the alloy, the pseudo eyes on here. I like these. They look good. Just as long as you're using something that's heavy enough to flip this hook over and make it ride upside down. Because that way it gives us a nice weedless presentation. Make a couple of wraps over the hook shank and under the eyes after you figure eighted it on there. And that way that'll lock them in a little bit. Bring your thread back to the barb of the hook. And just before I tie in the tails here, I'm going to take a spot of Liquid Fusion. This is a water-based cement I like using. I always glue eyes in place. There's a centrifugal force of the casting and bouncing around on the rocks, and that has a tendency to loosen them up. So I always put a little spot of glue in there, and that Liquid Fusion is nice, water-based, and it'll bleed down to the hook shank. Now, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some Crinkle mirror flash. It's a flash product. I like the reflective capabilities of it. It's one of my favorites. So I'm going to use root beer. We're making a crayfish colored fly here. So I use a root beer. One of the tips I do anytime you're using these flash materials, just cut a little hole in the package. You can just take your scissor points, put it in that hole, and draw out what you need. And it keeps your bench a whole lot neater. Now I've got the package, I've got what I need, and I don't have a big mess. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to tie it on top of the hook shank. Take the forward part of this, come back over, that way I've got it locked in place. And then about length of the hook shank, maybe a little bit longer. I'm just going to cut that off. Then I'm going to take 4 pieces of micro pine squirrel zonkers. This is a crayfish orange color. If I'm doing my crayfish in an olive color, I'll use the olive colors in these. But this is just an impressionistic fly. We got a lot of motion in here, things moving around. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take and I'm going to tie one of these on the bottom. Try to get the leather strip portion of it towards the shank. It's not a big deal if it doesn't. And I'm going to tie one on each quarter of the hook shank. All this is going to do is just enclose 360 degrees of the hook shank. Just bind them down in there. Doesn't matter how they come out. And one on the top. And then finally one on my side of the vise here. I'll just rotate the vise. And now we've got our flash and our tail in there. And I'll just bring this back I'm going to cut these just a little bit longer than what the flash is on there. And bring my thread back to that point above the barb and the hook. So I've just got a great big tie-in point here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some polar chenille. This is a ultraviolet product, reflects a lot of light. I'm going to tie that in real well, just a big old piece of chenille basically. Crank that in. Then I'm going to come up the hook shank and I'm going to take a couple of pieces of barred round rubber. And I'm just going to lay those on top of the hook shank. And I'm going to loosely figure eight those on top of the hook. And that way they'll stay in place. And then what I do is I make a couple of tight wraps in front and a couple of tight wraps behind. And they'll stay right in place for you. Then I'm going to advance my thread. Up in front of the eyes. And now I'm just going to take and I'm going to palmer this stuff forward. And we just need to keep that rubber out of there as we're doing this. And this isn't a hard deal to do, but you just want to keep stroking that back and keep all your rubber legs and everything out of the way till you get up to the front there. And we just want to put a bunch of bulk in here with this polar chenille. And if you get some bare areas in here, that chenille will comb out at the end of the tie-in process. You can take a bodkin and pick that out if you want. And just kind of keep pulling on it as you're tying. Now when we get up to those rubber legs, I'm just going to pull those back and wrap my chenille right in front of them. And I'm just going to keep laying it on here. So we don't want any gaps in it. I want to get up to the eye here. And I figure I've got it nice and full. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure eight right over the eyes. Just so we don't have any gaps in that. Come back over it. Another wrap behind. I'm going to pull all of that backwards. And now I'm going to make a few wraps in the front here. Pull that up out of the way. Take your thread. Tie that off. Go in and trim that down. Then I'm just going to collect all these fibers. And make my head in here. And go in and trim out a couple of these sticking out, make it look a little nicer. Cover up the wraps, and then I'll whip finish this. Now when I cut this off, I don't want to just go in there and cut with my scissors because I may take a bunch of that polar chenille off. All you got to do is just take that thread, keep it tight, pull it against your scissor blades, and that'll cut it without ruining any of that material. And there's a finished Crazi Craw